Wamanjika. Welcome friends to part 46 of our series from Mark's Gospel as we follow Jesus on the road with his disciples. My name is Stephen Barro from the Melbourne chapter of God Squad, and I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, Australia. Today's reading is from Mark chapter 10 verses 35 to 45, and it's often called the request of James and John, or what Ched Myers refers to as the subversion of hierarchical power. The context is that we are entering the third cycle of Jesus' teaching on his way to Jerusalem and to the cross. The first two cycles emphasize Jesus' solidarity with the poor, the powerless, and the marginalized. And in today's passage, Jesus again needs to remind his disciples of this core value, as they once again seem to miss the point. So let's look at this passage together. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." He asked them, "What do you want me to do for you?" They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left hand in your glory." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with?" "We can," they answered. And may I suggest, that's a bit of sarcasm in there by the writer Mark. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or my left hand is not for me to grant. These places belong to those who they have been prepared for." When the other 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John, or read that they were really pissed off. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great amongst you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave for all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Let me read that last bit again. "Not so with you. Instead, who wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Well, once again, we have a very human story of the disciples. Despite having spent time with Jesus, they still seem to be influenced by the dominant culture around them, this time on what it means to be a leader and to wield power. I think Mark writes it this way so that his readers and us today can relate to the disciples, because they're so often getting it wrong and need to be taught, challenged, rebuked, and encouraged by Jesus. And he doesn't give up on them, just like he doesn't give up on us. Unfortunately, 2,000 years later, not much has changed, and this passage from Mark is perhaps more relevant for us now in how we view and aspire to power and leadership. They had a simple request. They wanted to be Jesus' number 2 and number 3, lieutenants in the new regime. A request that Mark records was done in isolation from the other disciples, and as we see, had consequences later on. In fact, we often see that when people aspire to power, they do it through backroom deals, away from the eyes of the public, and James and John were no different today. Also, interestingly, in the last 3 chapters of the Gospel, Mark records that Jesus' entire inner circle, Peter, John, and now in today's story, James, have all rejected Jesus' way and copped his rebuke. Remember that Nigel shared a few weeks ago from Mark chapter 9 that the disciples were arguing on the road about which of them was the greatest. And Jesus had to take them aside, as he does today, to speak about power and leadership in his kingdom. As mentioned earlier, I believe this is really relevant for us today, for we see throughout our churches and in the world the place of power, the lust for power, clinging on to power and fighting for power still goes on, often behind closed doors. I'm sure we can all think of examples of seeing this happen. Perhaps we're even doing it ourselves to some degree. So here's some reflections from today's passage for us. Leadership is about service, not status. Jesus redefines greatness by teaching that the greatest among those are those who serve others. True leadership isn't about authority or power, but it is about selfless service. How often do we need to learn this lesson? Jesus says that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over others, but not so with you. Jesus models and expects a different way. The Gospels are full of stories of Jesus reinforcing this point with his disciples, and in case they forget it, he demonstrates it to them later on by taking on the role of a servant, kneeling before them and washing their feet. What sort of leader do we aspire to be? Do we look to rule like a dictator, ordering others around? Or do we look to lead by serving, by getting our hands dirty ourselves, by enabling and offering a space for others? It was Shane Claiborne who said, if we want to rule in his kingdom, we better get ready to wash feet and clean toilets. This king rules with a towel, not a sword. In the kingdom of God, we descend into greatness. I love that term, descending into greatness. How many of us aspire to that? That challenges me to the core, and hopefully it does to you as well, as we descend into greatness like Jesus did. As we see, Jesus is constantly subverting the normal ways of doing things, talking about the first shall be last, talking about being like a child, talking about being a slave to all, reversing normal practices. Secondly, humility is central to leadership. James and John ask for positions of honour, but Jesus emphasises that leadership isn't about seeking personal glory. Instead, it's about humbling ourselves for the sake of others. We can all probably name so many leaders who do stuff for their own selfish gain, not for the good of their community, their church, or their country. We see examples of this every day in the news. War is full of these images. I watched a new movie the other day that's come out fairly recently, Civil War. It's about a fictitious US president who refuses to give up power. Imagine that, eh? It's said in the near future, a civil war has erupted in the United States. An authoritarian federal government led by a third-term president is fighting against rogue states who have risen up against this power-hungry government. And there's many great stories in there. But this movie illustrates the consequences of holding on to power. And yet it's only a movie, but through it we see real-life examples of self-serving leaders who lack genuine concern for the well-being of their people and use their own position for their own purposes and their own power. You just need to think of people like Putin in Russia, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Lukashenko in Belarus, Hung Sun in Cambodia, the military junta in Myanmar or Burma, just to name a few. A book I loved reading is called Servants and Fools by Boas, and he says leadership is about inspiring, challenging, or empowering others to join God's mission of redemption and healing, not about lording it over others. Does our leadership inspire others? Does it bring others along with us on the journey? Does it draw us and others closer to Jesus? The third point is sacrifice is part of leadership. Jesus speaks in this to James and John about the cup and baptism. He said we must undergo these, which symbolize suffering and sacrifice. This speaks of the paradox of God's ways, that leadership is only achieved through suffering and the cross. Contrast the irony between power and powerlessness. In this passage, Jesus cannot guarantee power, but he does guarantee suffering. Again, the great paradox of it all. Indeed, in this story, it would not be the disciples, it would not be James and John who end up at Jesus' right and left hand, but as we see later on in the story, in a few weeks' time, it will be two rebels at his crucifixion who are on his right and left hand. And church history is riddled with leaders that know this paradox well, who know what it is to suffer for following Jesus, whose leadership inspires others. For me, one person that I've always looked up to is Oscar Romero. He was bishop in El Salvador and became archbishop. in the late 70s, when he read the scriptures, he saw God's compassion for the powerlessness at the hands of the powerful. He saw what was happening in his own country at the hands of the right-wing government, and how their death squads were killing people and killing anyone who opposed them. So Romero used his position to call out unjust actions, to speak for justice, to name for people on the government who were murdering their own citizens. He said at one point, when the church hears the cries of the oppressed, it must denounce the social structures that give rise to and perpetuate the misery from which the cries arise. Finally, the government couldn't stand it anymore. So on the 24th of March 1980, he was shot and murdered as he served communion in San Salvador, as he had upset the powerful too much and needed to be silenced. Yet instead of being silenced, still today he inspires others to continue his legacy, to serve others, to speak out, and to follow Jesus in the way of the cross. He understood well the paradox that leadership was just not about exercising power over people, but about suffering, and followed the crucified Christ. Another quote of his is, "Let us not tire of preaching love, for it is the force that will overcome the world." That leads on to the fourth point. Leadership is modelled after Jesus' example. Jesus, he said, he came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. This is the ultimate example of servant leadership, putting others first, even at the expense of ourselves. Again, it's a bottom-up style of leadership, in stark contrast to a top-down approach that we see throughout the world today. Jesus' role reversal between the great and the slave class is a direct attack on the status hierarchy in the ancient world of today. These were radical words for Jesus to say this, as a slave was a possession, not a human. Yet what does it mean when Jesus says we must be like slaves if we truly want to lead? He's equating slaves and leaders together, completely unknown. No wonder they wanted him killed. And finally, leadership involves leading by example. We've talked about this already. Jesus just doesn't instruct his disciples, he shows them by his own actions. True leaders inspire others by living out the values they teach. So there's much in here for us today who aspire to be leaders. Who do we aspire to be like? What are we influenced by? Who are we influenced by? Are we looking to Jesus' subversive ways and teachings? And how do we use our positions of leadership and privilege to serve and support those around us? Again today, as we conclude, let's listen to the words of Jesus. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. I pray today that we can take these words to heart and to live them out as we follow the crucified and risen Jesus. Amen.